Now, this is where it gets interesting, right? The big claim to fame for central banks, beyond basically being, if you will, the money managers, right, was that when you have independent central banks, and this is the whole thing about the European Central Bank, you get rid of inflation. Well, looking at the past inflationary episode that we've just lived through, that's pretty much over. I think, touch wood, we'll see. It was nothing like the 1970s. More recent research has shown that the 1970s was actually nothing like we thought it was. It wasn't cured by a giant hike in interest rates. It was very like what we had in 2020 and 2021. It was a series of supply shocks that went through a decade. Everything from the cost of the war in Vietnam, failed harvests in Russia, Canada, the United States, the 73 oil spike, integrating women and minorities in the American labor market at a time of very, very high labor market tightness. Lots of things like this that all pushed up prices, and then eventually it all dissipated. Now, central banks have said, if it wasn't for us and our credibility and our desire to be tough on interest rates and all that, then you wouldn't have inflation would still be flying ahead. Not entirely convinced that's the case. And if a large part of your job description is control inflation, and what you've been doing is putting up interest rates, and those interest rates, all they've done is basically bugger up investment and hasn't really done anything to the price level. What's happened is that supply chain things have worked out and energy prices have come down. It's got nothing to do with what you've done. Essentially, you're probably not that really good at that side of your job. So, do you need a central bank if you have a national currency? Yes, it's really handy because you'll eventually have a financial crisis. You'll need to do bailouts. You need to do all this sort of stuff. This is what you do. It's money management. Do you need somebody that's going to process your export earnings, create foreign reserves? Absolutely. Do you need a debt management office? Yes, you do. Do you need people who think that they actually run the economy with these two very crude tools? No, that's just me.
In this system, these tools, are they true for every central bank, basically for every currency?
No, I mean, if you're the Argentine central bank, it doesn't really matter what you do.
Okay, but technically,
well, technically, I could still marry a supermodel, but it's never going to happen, right? So,
okay.
What's the point? Here's an interesting one, right? Over 90% of all moves in interest rates by other central banks are direct responses to whatever the Federal Reserve does. So these independent central banks may be independent from their own politicians and their own constituents, but they're not independent of the big central bank, which is the Fed.
And that is, in the US, independent from the government. But in other countries, is it different?
Well, most countries, during the 1990s and 2000s, there was a huge move towards much more independent central banks across the world in the belief that this gave you better inflation control and economic performance. There was then a backlash against this, which began in Russia and then in Hungary. You now see this in China. The Chinese central bank was notionally independent, is now firmly under the control of the Communist Party's Finance Committee. So there's been a move back from this in a way, partly is in reaction to what happened in the financial crisis. Look, I have sympathy for the central bankers here, right? Governments around the world for years and years said, we shouldn't do economics. They'll let the market decide. Over to you guys set interest rates and I'm sure everything else will work out. And for a while it did, particularly because we were piling up lots and lots of consumer debt, never mind public debt. But eventually it comes home to roost and we had a financial crisis. Now, at that point, we said to the central banks, right, lads, fix this. And they went, you're shitting me, right? Can't you do something? Oh, no, we don't do that. You're independent. You sort it out. Now, they've got two tools, raise and lower the price of money. You're facing a gigantic collapse. You put money at zero. You can go below zero. Nobody even knows what that means, but you're not getting much traction on that. There's not much in the accelerator, right? So the other one is you buy and sell assets. So what do? You buy as many bonds and assets as you can. You chuck money into the system. But what does that mean? Well, what it means is that people who have assets are being rewarded for selling their assets. What do? They buy more assets. And they buy more assets. And what does that do? It gives them more wealth. So what you're doing is you're basically increasing wealth inequality and income inequality in the name of restoring prosperity, which is why we've got populism and everything else in Europe and everywhere else. Because this great recovery that we went through from 2008 to 2016, particularly in Europe, was an utter disaster for about 60% of the population who didn't have assets.
How would you judge then? I mean, they are important. So how would you judge then the performance of one of these central bank managers, let's say Jerome Powell. I don't know what your opinion is about him, but how would you even think about judging his actions?
I think the way that you phrase that is really interesting. How should you think about judging his actions, right? Is it unfair that the Federal Reserve has de facto been handed by Congress the responsibility of managing just the domestic economy of the United States without regard to anything else, while it is de facto the actual global central bank and has to care about international monetary conditions because everybody else uses the dollar? No, that's not fair, but it's on the job description. Is it
Mm.
fair for Congress to say, we don't even do bills now? We just write about tweet stuff. We're angry all the time. We don't know what we're angry about. We're just angry about stuff. We're angry about trans this week. This is it, right? Meanwhile, actual investment, economic management, forward planning, climate change, whatever, we're not going to do that. And we're just going to tell the central bank they shouldn't do it either. On the job description, yes. Fair, no, right?